about 12% or 13% of all global cargo trade goes through the Suez Canal, and the energy share of it, if I remember right, is even higher. So it's really the energy play that shapes Suez as what it is. Choke points in general are important, but the Suez Canal, in some ways, at least given the current geopolitical chessboard, is even more important, has been even more important over the last 50 years because of its role in the global energy trade.
You're watching The Gist on Strat News Global. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. Our special guest today is Mr. Nilanthan Niruthan, the Executive Director of the Center for Law and Security Studies in Colombo, and one of my favorite guests because I believe he's one of the uh, smartest and savviest geopolitical analysts I've ever spoken to. And over this conversation, I'm sure you'll agree with me. Thank you for joining us, Nilanthan.
Thank you for having me. This is my favorite show to appear on, so the feeling's mutual.
All right. So now that we're done with our sort of mutual admiration society, um, let's get down to basics. Today we're going to be discussing a choke point called the Suez Canal. And for our regular viewers, if you look back, you might remember that we've done one on the Panama Canal and we've done one on the Malacca Straits. If you haven't, I suggest you look them up later. We're talking about the Suez Canal because, again, anything that happens in the canal impacts the whole world in a geopolitical sense. I mean, would you just put that into a bit of perspective?
The Suez Canal in general, I would say, is probably the most geopolitically important choke point at the moment, simply because of its impact on the energy trade and so on. So the Suez Canal, as you know, is what links up the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, and therefore it really cut short the transit time between Europe and Asia, and it was created way back in the 1860s, if I'm not mistaken. And it really changed global trade in a way that we perhaps don't really appreciate to this day, because it cut down travel by an enormous amount and it made the modern world possible. So, out of all the choke points that we will discuss and we have discussed so far, the Suez Canal, you could argue, has had the biggest impact on modern day life because it's what's really facilitated the modern energy trade. Because
Hmm.
a large chunk of modern energy trade to this day goes through that point, so to speak, and therefore, as you pointed out, the entire world depends on this man-made artificial construct.
Hmm. So, I remember that there was once a few years ago a ship that got stuck there and it sort of interrupted shipping for a long time and
For six
caused a lot of
days.
stir. Yes. So, I mean, is that something that could happen again?
It's something, you know what, because of human error, it's something that we can never really discount. So usually what happens is, I mean, whether this is this and all other aspects of safety and security and all that, human error is what we have still not overcome. And because of that element, yes, something like that could happen again. And how many countries are prepared for something like that? How many countries would have a plan B for something like that? How many countries are actually wargaming and forecasting what might happen if we face a situation like that? All of that is very open ended, but yes, that can absolutely happen again.
So, correct me if I'm wrong. This is the canal that connects the Indian Ocean with the Mediterranean in a broader sense, if you want to look at it that way. And before that, it goes through the Strait of
The Bab el Mandeb.
Bab el Mandeb, right? So that also is a choke point. That's where the Yemenis and the Houthis have been having a thing. So is that the only way to get through to the Mediterranean from here? The other route would be again much longer route via Africa, right? The Horn of Africa.
a much longer route via Africa, or you can try to do it through the Strait of Hormuz, which is a little further north. But once again, that would increase your time and cost enormously. So going through the Bab el Mandeb is the logical choice, right? I mean, whether it's entering the Red Sea or exiting the Red Sea from the Indian Ocean side, the Bab el Mandeb just geographically makes too much sense, which is why Djibouti, for instance, is so geopolitically important, and that's why so many different countries do their best to have some kind of military presence in Djibouti, because there's a almost a common understanding now that this is a very, very key spot on the world map.
Hmm. But the canal itself is owned and run by the Egyptians, right?
Yes, so it's an interesting story, right? So it was built by the French in the 1860s with the permission of, at that time, the Egyptian and the Sudanese governments, at the kingdoms rather, were the ones whose permission you would have to get. So the French got their permission, started constructing, blah, blah. It took about 10 years. And it was always very contentious. There was always a competition between the British and the French, because the British thought that the Middle East should be their sort of backyard, and that this was giving the French a huge geostrategic advantage there. And finally, as you would probably know and remember, in 56 was when things really flared up, when President Nasser nationalized the canal. So basically, it was owned by the Egyptian government, but it was being operated by the Suez Company. And the
Hmm.
Suez Company was primarily British and French shareholders. So Nasser made this big speech that more than 100,000 people had been killed in the construction of this, from cholera, fatigue, blah, blah, blah. And he nationalized the operation of it. And once again, one of the first examples of the victor being diplomatically forced to relinquish a winning position. You and I have had this conversation many times, where I've often pointed out that this whole era of international law and diplomatic pressure is an era of about 70 to 80 years that's dying out now. And that for the
Hmm.
vast majority of human history, we've not had that. The Suez Canal, the Suez Crisis of 56, at least the way I see it, is in many ways kind of the opening glories of that, globalist period, where you could get the international community, because the UK, France, and Israel, they did manage to take control on a military level. That operation was a success. But Eisenhower was furious. I mean, the entire American establishment was furious. The UN was furious. This is back when there was still some hope that the UN would be an actual functional organization, and control of it had to be given back to the Egyptians. So,
Hmm.
in that sense, it was also a historically important event. And what happens to the Suez Canal is in many ways emblematic of the world order as well.
Hmm. But the earning that Egypt sort of gets from the Suez Canal is a pretty large chunk. It goes into billions and billions of dollars. But how much of traffic really flows through that canal on an average day? I mean, what kind of traffic flows through it? Do you
If
have
I'm
large
not
oil
mistaken,
tankers and all that going through as well?
yeah, so if I'm not mistaken, about 12% or 13% of all global cargo trade goes through the Suez Canal. And the energy share of it, if I remember right, is even higher. So it's really the energy play that shapes Suez as what it is. Choke points in general are important, but the Suez Canal, in some ways, at least given the current geopolitical chessboard, is even more important, has been even more important over the last 50 years, because of its role in the global energy trade. And as you know, fossil fuels are not going anywhere. I mean, renewable energies, a lot of people agree, is the future, but in terms of scalability, the cost effectiveness, and all that, renewables are still far, far from being able to catch up. So, the world's energy security is going to be synonymous with the Suez Canal's security and the Bab el Mandeb's security and the Strait of Hormuz's security. So, even though these larger discussions can give us a much better historical and political context,
Hmm.
let's face it, it's all about energy for the most part.
Hmm. If I can just sort of step aside a little bit, I'm talking about it from, let's say, an Indian perspective. A lot of the oil that we import from Russia, for instance, would probably come through the Suez, right?
Yeah, they would probably come through the Suez. There might be like land routes. So I'm not too sure what India's situation is, but I'm assuming because when you think about it, until the Arctic lines and all that freeze thaw out,
Hmm.
my guess is that it would still make a lot more sense to go through and come through the Suez and then join up with the Indian Ocean.
Okay. I'm curious because, given the sanctions and all that, it would be very easy to block such a flow if they really wanted to.
Yeah, so there's something called the Constantinople Convention, if I remember right, which is like this big convention that says
Hmm.
that both during times of peace and war, the Suez Canal should be open to all countries and all that. But let's face it, once again, that convention uh, was written in a different day and age. In today's day and age, it's just a piece of paper. In the nuclear age, it's simply a piece of paper. But uh, just trying to block that off would not be, that would hurt everybody. You would have to
Hmm.
expect a huge spike in energy prices in general. You would have to expect a lot of geopolitical turbulence in general. And then there's the question of what do you do about the ghost fleets and stuff like that, because the Russian kind of energy export is a large part of it, as you know, is through these ghost fleets and stuff like that. So trying to put up physical barriers in choke points to filter them out would hurt everybody.
Hmm. But again, I mean, staying on that same point, when we talk about ghost fleets, from what I understand, they're basically uninsured vessels that come through without. I mean, so is there a law which says that you can't have uninsured vessels crossing the canal?
No, there's no law which says that, but it's a matter of registration and identification and things like that,
Hmm.
where a lot of the formal procedures that you have are what you would use for insurance as well. I mean, the shipping industry, as you know, a lot of the data is with the insurance companies. A lot of the indicators are kind of determined by the insurance companies and all that. So, in that sense, they operate in a, I wouldn't say bubble, but they operate almost in a parallel universe, which is why we would call them ghost fleets. And if you were to put down physical barriers, trying to actually stop them and all that, you would be shooting yourself in the foot, because everybody would have to be ready to take. That would almost be like a World War III situation where the great powers cannot really uh, agree on what exactly happens. If the Americans try to do that, the Russians and the Chinese would then say that they have a military and humanitarian reason, justification for military options, and that would escalate into something much bigger.
Hmm. But at the entrance at that other strait that we were talking about earlier, that is also a place which is prone to a lot of piracy and stuff like that, right? That region.
Yes,
How
approach
bad
a
is
lot of.
that?
So that's a lot of it is now low end. So, for example, if you look at October
Hmm.
globally, there have only been four piracy reported incidents. One has been in the Singapore Straits, and the
Okay.
other have all been in like the anchorages of the Congo and Lagos and all that. So we haven't seen that area. The piracy there has been controlled a lot thanks to a lot of international efforts. No, you must.
Hmm.
I mean, I must add that India too has been somewhat active in those regions as well in exerting some kind of maritime control. So it's been a team effort, and that team effort has been paying off, and you're
So,
not really seeing the huge spike in piracy and armed robbery of the Babel Mandeb and all that that we've been seeing in previous times. No.
so even Somalia and those areas in that are in that region, right?
Yeah, the Horn of Africa. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, a ship that, for instance, let's say is denied entry because of the Houthis or whatever into the Bab el Mandeb, would that be then going through piracy infested waters if it has to go
Well,
all
I
the way
mean,
around?
so with the Houthis, for instance,
Yes.
now their ability to exert that kind of coercive control, we've not seen them exercise that in a while.
Uh-huh.
Even though the Saudis and the Americans have not been able to wipe them out completely, the Houthis are not really having the Suez Canal hostage right now the way that they did for a pretty brief period of time. In that
Okay.
particular area, if you look at the Bab el Mandeb, so because the pirates are not ideological actors, the pirates
Hmm.
are economic actors. So if we were to look at Somalian fishermen, for instance, the guy might go out to sea just in his regular activities as a fisherman, and then he might see a vulnerable target and take out the AK-47 that was under the rug. He might have gone out to sea even without the intention of committing an act of piracy, and it then becomes a crime of opportunity. So the pirates are strictly driven by environmental and economic factors, while the Houthis are driven by, you could argue, political factors.
Hmm.
So you would have to deal with both of these as two different pieces rather than worrying about the two of them meshing. If they do mesh, then we would have a bigger problem on our hands. But right now, it doesn't look like there's any chance of them meshing.
Hmm. We talked about it being almost 12% of the global trade. Is that what you said through going through that? Now, essentially, from what I understand, if you look at it, it connects the Indian Ocean with the Mediterranean Ocean. So that means basically Europe and the rest of the world in some ways. I mean, or are we looking at something beyond that?
No, I mean, so Europe and Asia, and that was always the vision, the founding vision of the Suez Canal itself. So there's another interesting fact. The oldest examples of such a canal go back something like 4,000 or 5,000 years, something like 2000 BC, or that there's archaeological evidence suggesting that
Hmm.
during the time of, I think, Darius the Third and many other kings of the ancient age, there have been attempts to build the canal. So the vision was always to link Europe and Asia in some way.
Okay.
And whatever else has come in has been consequences of the modern world. But what you just outlined, linking these two areas, yes, that is the fundamental crux and purpose of the Suez Canal.
So, if you look at it from the Mediterranean point of view, you're looking at the Suez as an exit to the Indian Ocean, and the Strait of Gibraltar perhaps is the other exit or entrance, whatever you want to call it. Is there any other inlet or outlet into that
Uh,
Mediterranean region?
No, I mean, not on the level where you can actually facilitate macro numbers through
Uh
them. So
huh.
I'm not too sure if there are micro channels and all that, but
Sure.
on a macro level, no. And in order to join the Indian Ocean from one side, you either go through the Strait of Hormuz or you go through the Bab el Mandeb. So once again, like you have two options, and based on your geography, you pick whether you enter the Indian Ocean through Hormuz or through the Bab el Mandeb.
Hmm. So, given that Egypt technically is sort of the owner of the thing, you mentioned a treaty that says that, you can't do this and you can't do that. But can Egypt still hold the canal to ransom if it wanted to? Or anybody else in that region who could hold the canal to ransom?
Well, I mean, the Israelis, French, and British proved that they could militarily take over in
Hmm.
56, but the global opinion kind of swung against them, and they had no choice but to withdraw. So, even if a military takeover was possible, if some kind of amphibious operation was to be launched and a military takeover became possible, it's the political repercussions that one would have to worry about. I have no reason to suspect that the Americans and the Russians are not capable of it. So I think perhaps the Americans and the Russians maybe in a well planned amphibious operations with the help of maybe the Israelis or the Saudis. Maybe that's possible for one of those two. But once you do that, can you deal with the political fallout? Because that will spark World War III. That will spark a major conflagration that will take this beyond all our controls. So, yeah, I think there are plenty of superpowers that technically should be capable of doing it, but would they? That's a different question.
How about, a worst case scenario of a terrorist takeover?
See, a terrorist, it would almost have to be like those 90s spy novels written by Tom Clancy and all that, right? Some real sophisticated non state actor might be able to pull it off,
Hmm.
but then will they be able to deal with the consequences? Look, if the Russians and the Americans are scared to deal with the global consequences of militarily taking over the Suez Canal, then some terror group or pirate group better be ready for the hailstorm of fire that will be dropped on them from the heavens by all the superpowers uniting together, and they will be reduced to ash on the spot. Something like that by a non state actor will simply unite everybody to act together. Unless they had the patronage of some larger power, there's no way
Hmm.
they can hold it. No way.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying that they could hold it forever, but they could say that, unless you do this or that, we'll blow up the whole damn thing, and then, you're in trouble anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just speaking of novels earlier. There's a famous book written in the 70s by Frederick Forsyth, The Devil's Alternative,
That's
of
right.
Ukrainian separatists hijacking an oil tanker and stuff like that, threatening an environmental disaster. So, yes, that is certainly possible, but that's always been possible ever since the concept of a choke point, came into play. The
Hmm.
closing, I mean, Vasco da Gama discovered this point of the world because a choke point was closed off in another part of the world. So the idea that choke points can be taken over and that the globe can kind of be held hostage, that's always been there and that will always continue to be there. So yes, we can't really discount that risk. You're right.
Hmm. Well, coming back to trade itself, you mentioned that energy is one of the biggest things that goes through that thing. Apart from energy, what else goes through that area? I mean,
If I'm
what
not
kind of goods
So if
go
I'm not
through?
mistaken, lot of metals, minerals, fertilizer, stuff like that.
Hmm. And
Because
you're talking
many
about traffic from Europe out to the Indian Ocean, or the other way around as well.
so I'm talking about the import traffic.
Hmm.
So many of the smaller South Asian countries, I mean, if we were to even take Sri Lanka as an example, right?
Right.
So we import a lot of iron and steel, we import a lot of sugar. Sometimes there are local disruptions in production here, so we have to import rice and wheat,
Hmm.
stuff like that. So, and many of the smaller South Asian nations are pretty much like that as well. Crude oil is a big thing that we're all dependent on in
Right.
terms of imports, and fertilizer, minerals, metals. So all of that flowing through either the Strait of Hormuz or the Bab el Mandeb. As in, if
Hmm.
it's not an Indian partner, so the trade that's coming in from other parts will come in through these channels.
And what is the kind of stuff that goes into Europe from the Indian Ocean?
Well, to be honest, not as much as they should be going. I mean, at one point of time, it was the opposite, where South Asians would give the Europeans tea and spice and masala and all that, and we would get gold and silver and diamonds in return. We would just give them stuff that was so cheaply available, and they would have to give us precious stuff. But now it's the other way around, where South Asia in general does not export that much. I mean, there's apparel, coffee, cinnamon, spices and herbs,
Hmm.
rubber, right? Raw materials. But in
Okay.
terms of us being like a major export hub to the rest of the world and to
Hmm.
Europe, where if this was disrupted, where the Europeans go, oh my God, what will I do? Where will I get alternatives to this? No, unfortunately, that doesn't exist on a big scale.
So Chinese exports would be mostly land-based in this case, I suppose. It wouldn't be really going through this, except for
Yes,
energy.
and that would be far more reliant on the Malacca Strait. The
Okay.
maritime trade there would be far more reliant on the Malacca Strait rather than this.
No, I'm
Because
talking
there,
about Chinese exports to Europe.
or Chinese exports to Europe, absolutely, yes. So there would be a small component because the
Hmm.
Chinese still do use the Suez Canal. They offload it into the Indian Ocean and take it there. So there is that part as well. But yes,
Right.
a lot of it would be land as well.
Because they built railroads and all that stuff connecting right up to into Europe. So I mean that
Yes.
shouldn't be really a
I mean,
now. Tell me another.
they're still reliant on it. Let's not downplay that, but not
Hmm.
as much as some of the other nations in the region.
Hmm. What about energy? Does China get a lot of energy which is land based, which comes in from Russia and other places, so it doesn't have to go through the Suez?
Yeah, so over the last 10 to 15 years, China has become very, very cognizant of its energy security issue. You
Hmm.
could argue this is why China is so worried about the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, blah blah blah, because they realize that there's a big weakness there. They have diversified into land-based energy imports as well. They have put in a lot of investment, a lot of time into getting their energy through the land as well. But
Hmm.
it's still not to the level where they don't have to worry about the maritime component at all. A huge amount of it still comes in through the Indian Ocean. And the Indian Ocean will always be a critical thing because logistically, I mean, China is a huge country, right? This is not a medium sized country where you can reroute certain things and still get it at the same effect. China
Right.
is so huge that any rerouting would have a major logistical impact on the country. So,
Hmm.
yeah, you're right. They are a lot more, they've done a good job in building steady land based access to energy, but they're still very dependent on the Indian Ocean and therefore dependent on all the choke points that come before that as well.
Hmm. One of the things that was often touted as an alternate to the Suez Canal is something called the North-South corridor, which comes in from Russia all the way into Iran, which of course is in the doldrums because Iran itself is under sanctions and there's a lot of not happening. But let's I mean assume for a second that that corridor actually comes through. Would that ease the pressure on the canal itself, on the Suez Canal? Would that really be an alternate to the canal?
See, it would be an alternative for those who are willing to be enterprising. It would be an alternative for those who are willing to take the risk and start doing that because you don't know geopolitically what the consequences might be, what territorially the consequences might be, what security wise the consequences might be. So, and then as it becomes a practice, I mean, let's not forget that with the Suez Canal itself, despite it cutting the time so short and all that, there were plenty of skeptics. In fact, as construction began, the commentary on the Suez Canal in the 1850s was almost predominantly skeptical. And people were like, nah, I'm still going to take the long route. And it was a slow process where people finally got the confidence and they started making money, started turning a profit. It will be a long generational process. So even if these, first of all, I share your cynicism as always in these alternate routes and all that. Just go through the news the last 20 years, right? People say, oh, this is going to be the alternative to the Panama Canal. This is going to be the alternative to the Suez Canal. We're going to build
Right.
this pipeline. We're going to build this corridor. We're going to build this whatever. And all
Mhm.
these major macro projects all end up, as you put it, in the doldrums. And to a
Right.
certain extent, that's where they belong. Because if you have countries which are there in 5 year electoral cycles or 10-year electoral cycles, this is bound to happen, which is why
Hmm.
most of the major channels today, we discussed the Panama Canal a few weeks ago, that was man made as well. And this is all from the 1800s. Since the 1800s, since the world got together, we've not really been able to construct these major geoengineering projects that change global trade the way that the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal did, because that takes vision, that takes sacrifice. Tens of thousands of people will die. That's the only way you can build something like this. So I
Hmm.
am very cynical and skeptical in terms of whether any of these alternative routes will even come into fruition in the first place. And
Hmm.
even if they do, it will their credibility will have to be built generationally rather than overnight. So it's not going to change the immediate geopolitical equation in any way.
Hmm. So, you put the canal into a very, very clear geopolitical perspective. But let's assume for some reason that something does happen in that area, whether it's a Houthis or whether it's, a terrorist takeover. What are the options left before the world? Do they have to again go via the Horn of Africa to sort of reach Europe?
No, the world wouldn't be able to afford that. The world would have to launch some kind of military strike to take back control, because going taking the long route is not sustainable, especially with the age of AI and China now investing so much in AI to where the Americans and the Chinese are almost in an arms race with critical minerals heating up and all that. No, these companies are not going to be able to afford going the long route for their energy supplies. The global powers will have to get together and eliminate that threat and take back control. We will lose an enormous amount of money and even global stability if everybody had to start going the long route.
A bit of that did happen when the Houthis were sort of, jumping up and down that region.
Yeah, that did. However, that showed us that it was possible in the short run. But remember, before things went back to normalcy, it was almost getting to like a critical point
True.
where everybody was like, man, this temporary solution is not going to last. It's like, when you're 9 months pregnant, at some point of time, the baby has to come out.
Right.
So it's not sustainable to just say, "Hey, I'm just going to stay pregnant forever." It will come out. So at most, you could have, in my estimation, a 4 month or 5 month period with all these hectic alternatives. But other than that, no, we would be in deep trouble.
That puts the whole canal into a very, very neat perspective. And some of the things that I just heard from you, even I didn't know. I mean, how critical the canal is for global trade and commerce. But, before we conclude, I'm just trying to understand, for South Asia, that includes Sri Lanka, that includes India, that includes, let's say, the subcontinent. Uh, how big a problem is, let's say, not having access to the canal? I mean, do you think it could get by getting stuff from somewhere else?
See, energy wise, if India is willing to kind of, because if something like that happens, it also means energy prices would spike,
Right.
which means that we are not going to be able to afford it. In fact, in 2022, the major crisis happened here simply because people could not afford energy. And that became a,
I'll just interrupt you for a second there.
yeah.
Energy, a lot of it does also come from, the Gulf states, which don't necessarily have to send it through the canal to reach South Asian states, right?
Yeah, but the price will still go up. See, the
Of course.
problem doesn't become whether it's physically possible or not. As you
Hmm.
rightly pointed out, physically there will be alternatives. But the question becomes, can we then afford it? So even when we had the major energy breakdown here, there
Hmm.
was energy available. We just didn't have the money to pay for it because it was
Right.
so expensive compared to the dollars that we had. So
Hmm.
in that sense, I would say that the smaller nations in South Asia are still not resilient at all. I mean, Bangladesh is not resilient at all against energy shocks. Sri Lanka, the Maldives, I mean, Pakistan maybe might get bailed out by the Americans now that there's a nice little relationship resurgence there. But in general, the smaller
Hmm.
countries here, either India gives us lines of credit
I lost you
and
for a
large
second there.
amounts of energy
Yeah.
at a Either India gives us lines of credit and large amounts of energy at an affordable rate, or we would start facing serious energy breakdowns here. So, South Asia in general, I would say, is very, very volatile when it comes to energy security. South Asia is very vulnerable to global energy price shocks.
So, I mean, this is such a fascinating conversation as always, but I'm afraid we have run out of time. So let's just close it on that particular note. And I mean, I just wanted to know what would be the next sort of choke point you would like to discuss.
So maybe we could discuss the Arctic because that's going to become the new choke point. And I know you
Absolutely,
guys
yes.
have done stuff on the Arctic, so maybe like an updated discussion. What's the latest that's been happening there?
Absolutely. That
Things
would
like
be
that.
wonderful. I'll look forward to that. Maybe we'll do that the next time because that's something that even I've been sort of trying to understand, but I'm sure you'll have a far better understanding of that. Thank you so very much. And it's a delight, as always, to have you with us. And I look
Thank you.
forward to
Thank you
having
for
you with us.
having me.
Thanks. And I'll be seeing you again soon. That was Nilanthan Niruthan. And by now, you must have guessed why I keep saying he's one of my favorite guests on this show. I do hope you enjoyed this particular edition of The Gist, where we discussed the choke point called the Suez Canal, and I look forward to seeing you again. This is Ramananda Sengupta.